Hello and welcome to this review of my IBM 611-2884. This keyboard was made by Alps for a line of IBM computer systems for the Asian market. This particular one is the Japanese version, although there's also a Chinese version. It's from 1984, and as I'm sure you can tell, it's barely been used at all, which might sound like a rare bird, but actually it's not at all. Someone on eBay had a cache of about 100 of these, brand new in box, and there's still a few on if you're interested. They're very cheap, about £17 at the moment, but the reason they haven't all sold yet is because the seller insists on a type of premium shipping that costs about 3 times as much as the board, and that's not counting import taxes. I got this one from someone in Europe and it had already been pre-converted, which is nice because the original is absolutely unusable out of the box. It's got a Saurus converter on it, but the original layout Sora program for it is super weird. Must be some kind of IT layout because it absolutely didn't make any sense to me and used all kinds of weird shortcuts like on the numpad and here that I really didn't see the point of. So I reprogrammed it myself and swapped some of the key locations around. For example, the numpad keys were originally where the nav cluster goes, but that's a bit counterintuitive, so I swapped them over instead. The nickname Pingmaster was coined by Dork Vader on account of the extreme pinging noise the switches and plate produce. Here, let me give you a quick taster of that. It uses green Alps SKCC switches, which are a shorter height version of the tall cream ones, such as those in my Apple M0110 I reviewed a while ago, which is also an extremely pingy board. Like the tall cream ones, the switches are buttery smooth, and like all Alps switches with a switch plate, the switch isn't 100% linear, as there is a tiny tactile bump when the slider clears the switch plate. This really isn't a bad thing though, it kind of helps to break up the monotony of linear switches. It's been suggested that these green ones are lighter in force than the tall cream ones, but I'm not sure. They don't feel exactly the same, these feel less springy, but I'm not completely convinced they're actually lighter. They're a tad heavy for my taste, so I actually prefer the later green SKCL Alps myself, which are just on the sweet spot for linear switches, which is about 50 to 55 grams of force. It has rather strange dimensions, being not at all particularly deep for a keyboard, let alone one as old as this, but it's very long. As far as build quality goes, it's pretty damn tough with a thick plastic casing and a metal mounting plate underneath. It weighs 1.7 kilos, which is actually lighter than a Model M, but it doesn't feel fragile at all. It feels sturdy and solid, and 1.7 kilos is still pretty damn heavy. It has small rubber pads at the bottom of the case to prevent it from slipping, but there are no flip-out feet, and although the board sits somewhat high off the top of the desktop, it's not actually that sharply angled. Originally it came with a massively thick cable with a very large connector, but it's been replaced by this tiny USB cable that's a fraction of the thickness of the original, but hey, at least now I can use it. On the back there's also the model sticker, which is silver, but it doesn't mention Alps or IBM. In fact, there's no IBM markings on it anywhere, which is a shame because the Western IBM keyboards have those cool badges on them, especially the square metal ones on the earlier IBM keyboards. There's a speaker behind a little grill here, as well as a volume control for it, but it doesn't work because I assume it requires either another converter or PCB or something else for that. It also has N-key rollover, by the way, presumably to match the specs of IBM's own Model F keyboard. Always nice to have. The keycaps are also very nice. They're pretty thick ABS double shots, and they use a cross mount, but they're not compatible with Cherry MX either way around. Being a Japanese keyboard, of course it has lots of Japanese characters on it, but thank God the letters are also listed in the Latin alphabet. The characters are shown in the bottom left instead of the top, which is a bit confusing, and I have to admit I make mistakes every now and then, but even still, it's actually one of my faster typing keyboards. Something else that takes a little getting used to is the profile of the keycaps, which is excessively pointy at the lower rows. I mean, look at this one. You can practically shave yourself with it. A large amount of the caps are unprinted and have relegible tops instead of being double shot, for which I printed my own legends after I'd reprogrammed it. Speaking of which, in order to get a fairly normal working layout, I reprogrammed the keys to be as modern as possible. Originally it had the enter key down here and 2 shift keys, I think one for numbers and the other for letters, but I made the large enter key here control and this the enter key instead. The 4 extra keys to the right of what is now the enter key were programmed by Sora to be undo, cut, copy and paste buttons, and they're pretty useful, so I kept those. I programmed this to be the nav cluster with arrow and nav keys, but I found that using tiny print text on all of these keys made it look somewhat dull, and the text didn't really stand out. So instead I used various symbols for the nav buttons, and text only for the top 3 buttons here. The backspace is tiny and not in a very good place, so I use this unused key here as an extra backspace button because it's relatively big and in the hopes of accidentally hitting it when I need it. The numpad I shifted to here as I mentioned, and because it's got so many buttons I could add both an equals and another backspace button here for a total of 3 backspaces, which is quite useful for my purposes. It has this 000 button on it, which I programmed to actually output 3 zeros, which is completely pointless of course, but I thought it was too cool not to. Overall, the layout is actually pretty modern now, I think. I still make 1 or 2 mistakes every now and then, but that's more to do with the actual angle of the keyboard and caps, and the placement of the lettering, I think, than anything else. So, how do I feel about this board? Well, it's awesome! I'm sure that if the shipping costs on that eBay auction were anywhere near reasonable, these would have sold out ages ago because they're really a pretty amazing buy. Nice switches if you don't mind them slightly on the heavy side, and the construction supports really quite modern layouts with some programming, and it even has N-key rollover. If you're interested, get one now because there's not that many left, and although the seller categorically refused in the past, maybe you can convince him now to sell with a less abnormal shipping service. That's it for this review. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on the Pingmaster.